I must play every game I get an ad for immediately. Cop Wars was absolutely notorious for spamming ads in every way possible. I'm talking about the same 5 ads back to back that I watched every day for like a couple months. I haven't seen any gameplay up until this point, but the game will be permanently ingrained into my brain. The game was rated pretty low at 2.7 on Google Play, but had 50 million downloads, which is absolutely insane. This game is pretty much the pinnacle of what putting a majority of your money into sales and completely skimping on R&D looks like. I was a bit skeptical as the ads were always some random mini games that had no gameplay footage at all. The previews also mirrored this by simply showing the same random mini games that had nothing to do with the actual game itself, at least not the part that I played through. There was surprisingly a good guided tutorial at the beginning of the game. It didn't just throw you in with no training wheels like some low budget games do. They had character bubbles with some sporadic voice acting every now and then. Some characters had them, but most of the story had no VA. The translation was also a little spotty with some odd phrases and grammatical errors, but not the worst that I've seen. The story was pretty basic, talking about beating the Black Legion or whatever, but honestly an acceptable tutorial and story opening. The art style is more cartoonish, very similar to Clash of Clans or Boom Beach, some Supercell games. I personally do like this type of art as it allows for a little bit lower quality without the game looking absolutely egregiously bad. A great choice by the developer as some of the animations were a little bit sus. Had this been a hyper-realistic game or an anime game, it would have definitely looked awful. The gameplay mechanics were definitely not the differentiator for this game. It was pretty much purely auto from what I've seen, and the animations were quite low quality. The gameplay consisted of a split screen that was oddly reminiscent of multiplayer Mario Kart. The enemy units and your units would simply throw volleys at each other with basically no interaction at all. It was quite surreal. The units would just trade damage until they died, and the player with the remaining units won. It was kind of like if your friend asked you to play a card game and it ended up just being I declare war. A bit disappointing. The game was definitely pay to win, or more specifically, had a bunch of gacha mechanics that could be circumvented by spending money. The first huge red flag we were introduced to was the hero system. They had like 50 of the highest tier SSR heroes, 10 of the purple tier heroes, and only like 3 of the rare blue heroes, which was kind of a weird spread. They did have some insanely surprising crossovers. The one I noticed was 4 Evangelion characters and Shaq, the basketball player, who somehow also made it in. Though this is kind of standard for gacha games, they used a shard system, which meant that you would need to pull multiple times to get an actual usable hero, which does kind of suck. But some games can do it well. The second huge red flag was that they instantly showed heavily discounted bundles like 10 minutes into playing the game. It had some crazy number like $70 crossed out or something, and instead it was in quotes discounted to 99 cents. Heavy pay-to-win games always have this in them to try and bait you into spending a low amount of money to then commit to playing the game. The original full value of the pack is always just some random number too. Now the third and final red flag, and this is probably the most egregious one, is that they had a VIP system in the game based on spending money. Some games can have more free-to-play friendly VIP systems, but this one did not look like one of those. VIP systems almost always scream pay to win, as it just explicitly rewards you for spending money more than others. The general game type is one of those games where you can have a main base and there's a huge live world map that has different players and continual events that you can interact with. If you haven't played phone games like this before, it's kind of like Sid Meier's Civilization games, just kind of gotchified and meant to be played over a continual period of time. I actually really like these types of games as it does have a multiplayer aspect to it where you can build near your guild or alliance and attack and hold structures that give bonuses to you. It gives the game an element of competing with other players without having to be on at the exact same time. Only issue is most of these types of mobile games are just super pay to win, and the top guilds usually just eat all the content. The main way to progress that I've seen is through a research tree from your town hall. This requires gold and shards of the specific research that you are trying to do, whether it be higher level units or gold mines. You would get shards through beating mobs around the world map. It is kinda a nice way to do it since the game didn't have too many random resources that you had to worry about, simply gold and shards. The unit upgrades seemed a bit weird, just having to combine them from level 1 up to whatever max level that you have. There is probably a easier way to do it endgame, but it was kind of interesting, at least early on. Finally, the UI of the game honestly wasn't bad. It of course followed that cartoonish look, which to me was nice. It did have the small animations throughout, like notifications having some movement and acquiring resources had its own small animation, which just gives life to the game. I was pleasantly surprised as this is not something you can take for granted, especially for some lower quality gacha games. Now it's time for the final rating of the game. My system of rating for now is 10 points for graphics, 10 points for gameplay, 10 points for story, 10 points for progression, and finally 10 points for my personal opinion on if I will continue to play the game. In total, it'll be out of 50 points or normalized to 5 stars, which is the Google Play rating scale. The graphics were actually pretty okay. I'll have to give it a 7 out of 10. As I mentioned earlier, the cartoony look really helps hide a lot of the flaws of a lower end game. If you are a game studio with 50 bucks to put into animation and like $100 billion to put into marketing, a cartoon game is definitely the move. The game basically had the minimum number of animations in the UI to make the game not feel completely flat, which is a nice thing. The point loss is mostly due to the combat being super low quality and the game lacking that refined feel you would expect from like a computer game or a high-end mobile game. The gameplay rating is the definition of mixed. I'll give it a 4 out of 10. The combat system is absolutely garbage. I've never seen a more weak combat system ever, I don't think. If we isolated just that, it would be 0. But included in gameplay is the type of game, which is that ongoing live world with other people in it. I love that type of game if done correctly. Granted, they didn't do it correctly, but that's more on the progression side of the game. Again, the actual fights were complete garbage, and the score is probably inflated due to my love for this style of active world mobile game. I'll have to rate the story a 5. They did have a tutorial and a system to guide you along the beginning of the game through quests. It's something that is small but can't be taken for granted. There was a little bit of world building with the antagonist being laid out, so it wasn't completely awful. The VA was definitely spotty, but it was sometimes there. The progression was a 2. I absolutely hate pay-to-win games and games that explicitly try to milk as much money as possible before you quit. This game had all the red flags of a pay-to-win game and didn't even give fun enough content to justify it. It felt like some systems were added just to make the game more confusing to make you pay to skip it. I can't really speak for endgame as much, but it did seem to have an explicit way to progress through the skill tree, which is why I got 2 points. And finally, do I like the game? Much to no one's surprise, no, not really. I'll have to give it a 3 out of 10. It honestly could have been okay. I love the feeling of a community and playing with friends, and nothing gives me that type of feeling like the type of game where you can build a city next to guildies and fight for landmarks. However, the game is just absolutely too cheap and such a cash bait. The combat is literally worse than some projects my friends made in high school computer science. There's really no excuse when you can afford to spam me with ads daily and get a collab with Shaq and Evangelion. This game was already uninstalled before I made this video and I don't even remember doing it. Overall, it was rated a 21 out of 50 or 2.1 stars out of 5. Definitely not the lowest score you can get, as that would be a 0. Honestly, it's about expected for a game like this. They obviously avoided showing any gameplay in the ads because they knew it was going to be disappointing. Games like this somehow always manage to work, as just getting people through the door and maybe dropping like $1 or 2 outscales making a decent game that is fun and replayable. It's a little bit sad, but that's just the reality of the world. Anyways, thanks for watching guys, and hey, if any endgame Top Wars players has something fun to share about endgame that justifies it, I'd be more than willing to hear about it.